December 7th, 1941. Admiral Yamamoto stood in the operations room of the Combined Fleet Headquarters, reading the first reports from Pearl Harbor. 6 American battleships sunk or sinking, hundreds of aircraft destroyed. The attack had exceeded even optimistic projections, but Yamamoto's face remained grave. An aide later recalled that the admiral showed no jubilation, only a tense silence as he studied the damage assessments. When another officer celebrated the victory, Yamamoto reportedly cut him short. They had not destroyed the American carriers, and more importantly, they had now guaranteed that America would fight with everything it had. Yamamoto understood something many of his colleagues did not. He had studied at Harvard University from 1919 to 1921. He had traveled across America, visiting oil fields in Texas, automobile factories in Detroit, steel mills in Pittsburgh. He had seen the industrial heartland that could outproduce Japan many times over. In the months before Pearl Harbor, he had opposed war with America. At an imperial conference, he had warned that he could run wild for 6 months to a year, but after that, he had no confidence in victory. The other admirals had noted his pessimism. Some dismissed it as excessive caution. Now, as the reports continued flowing in from Hawaii, Yamamoto knew exactly what he had unleashed. The attack itself represented a calculated gamble on a specific strategic assumption. Japan needed the resources of Southeast Asia, particularly oil from the Dutch East Indies and rubber from Malaya. But the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor represented a dagger pointed at Japan's southern flank. Any move south would leave Japanese supply lines vulnerable to American naval power. The solution, in the minds of the Japanese naval staff, was to cripple the Pacific Fleet in a single blow, then rapidly seize the southern territories while America reeled. By the time America rebuilt its fleet, Japan would control a defensive perimeter so vast and fortified that America would negotiate rather than pay the blood price of reconquest. But this plan contained a fatal assumption. It presumed America would have to choose between rebuilding its Pacific Fleet and maintaining its Atlantic commitments. It presumed America could not fight effectively in 2 oceans simultaneously. This assumption rested on a fundamental misunderstanding of American industrial capacity and strategic intent. The misunderstanding was not complete ignorance. Japanese intelligence had tracked American naval construction. They knew about the Two-Ocean Navy Act, passed by the United States Congress in July 1940. They knew America had authorized construction of 7 battleships, 18 aircraft carriers, 27 cruisers, 115 destroyers, and 43 submarines. On paper, this represented the largest naval expansion in American history. But Japanese planners made 2 critical errors in their assessment. First, they underestimated how quickly American shipyards could actually deliver these vessels. Japanese naval construction operated on traditional timelines. A battleship took 3 to 4 years to build. A carrier required similar time. American shipyards would revolutionize these timelines through mass production techniques borrowed from automobile manufacturing. Prefabricated sections, welding instead of riveting, assembly line methods applied to warship construction. An Essex-class carrier that would have taken 4 years using traditional methods would slide down the ways in 18 months. Second, and more fundamentally, they misunderstood American strategic determination. The Japanese plan assumed that America, faced with war in 2 oceans, would prioritize one theater over the other. That America would make a choice. But American strategic planning, even before Pearl Harbor, had already rejected this assumption. The United States would fight in both oceans simultaneously, at full strength in both. This was not bravado. It was a cold calculation based on industrial capacity that Japanese planners had failed to fully grasp. In Tokyo, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo received news of Pearl Harbor's success with satisfaction. Tojo, a career army officer who had risen through positions in Manchuria, had pushed hard for war with the Western powers. He believed Japan's destiny was to lead Asia, free from Western colonial domination. The army's position was straightforward. Japan needed resources. The Western powers controlled those resources, therefore Japan must seize them by force. The question of whether Japan could win a protracted war against America had been subordinated to the question of whether Japan could survive without the resources of Southeast Asia. Tojo had concluded that slow strangulation through economic embargo was unacceptable. Better to fight. But Tojo's understanding of America was filtered through his army experience in China and Manchuria. He had seen Western powers back down when confronted with Japanese determination. When Japan seized Manchuria in 1931, the League of Nations had protested but done nothing. When Japan invaded China proper in 1937, Western powers had wrung their hands but continued selling Japan oil and scrap metal. Tojo interpreted this as Western weakness and decadence. He believed America, a democracy focused on comfort and material wealth, would lack the will to fight a long, bloody war in distant waters. The Pearl Harbor attack would shock America into recognizing Japanese dominance in Asia as a fait accompli. This assessment would prove catastrophically wrong. But in December 1941, as Japanese forces swept south through the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies, the plan seemed to be working perfectly. American, British, and Dutch forces fell back before the Japanese advance. Singapore, the great British fortress, fell in February 1942 with 80,000 British and Commonwealth troops surrendering. The Dutch East Indies capitulated in March. By May 1942, Japan controlled an empire stretching from the borders of India to the Central Pacific, from the Aleutian Islands to the approaches to Australia. But even as these victories mounted, Yamamoto understood the clock was ticking. His 6 months to a year of running wild was already half expired, and America had not sued for peace. Instead, reports from intelligence sources painted an alarming picture. American shipyards were accelerating production. American factories were converting to war production at a pace that seemed impossible. And most ominously, America showed no sign of concentrating its forces in one ocean or the other. The two-ocean war was becoming reality. Across the world, in Germany, Adolf Hitler received news of Pearl Harbor with elation. For 2 years, he had watched with frustration as America supplied Britain with weapons, food, and raw materials through the Lend-Lease program. American destroyers escorted convoys across the Atlantic. American factories produced the tanks and aircraft that kept Britain in the war. Roosevelt had done everything short of formal war to support Britain, and German U-boats had been forbidden from attacking American vessels for fear of triggering American entry into the war. Now Japan had solved that problem. America was at war. Hitler's assessment of America was shaped by a toxic mixture of ideology and ignorance. He viewed America as a mongrel nation weakened by racial mixing and Jewish influence. He believed American military power was a facade, that American soldiers were soft, that American democracy would fracture under pressure. He had read American isolationist newspapers and concluded that America was divided, that a significant portion of the American population opposed war, that Roosevelt had dragged an unwilling nation into conflict. This would be America's weakness. When American casualties mounted, public opinion would force a negotiated peace. On December 11, 1941, Hitler addressed the Reichstag. He formally declared war on the United States, fulfilling Germany's obligations under the Tripartite Pact with Japan. But the declaration was more than a legal formality. It was a propaganda opportunity. Hitler spent much of the speech attacking Roosevelt personally, painting him as a warmonger controlled by Jewish financiers, blaming him for forcing Germany into war. The speech revealed Hitler's fundamental misunderstanding. He thought he was declaring war on Roosevelt, not on America. He thought American resolve was tied to one man's ambitions, not to a national determination that Pearl Harbor had crystallized into steel. Hitler's military advisors had their own assessments, and they were more grounded in material reality than their Führer's ideological fantasies. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, commander of the German Navy, had long argued that Germany could not win a war against Britain while America supplied the British war effort. The only solution was unrestricted submarine warfare against all shipping in the Atlantic, including American vessels. Now, with America formally at war, Raeder saw opportunity. German U-boats could hunt American shipping without restriction. The United States had a tiny merchant marine protection force. The American East Coast was virtually undefended. U-boats could operate in American coastal waters with impunity. And initially, Raeder's assessment seemed correct. In January and February 1942, German U-boats launched Operation Drumbeat against American coastal shipping. Tankers and freighters silhouetted against the lights of American cities made easy targets. In the first 6 months of 1942, German submarines sank over 300 ships in American waters. Raeder believed this was the beginning of a campaign that would strangle American war production before it could reach Europe. If German U-boats could sink ships faster than American shipyards could build them, America's industrial power would be irrelevant. But Raeder, like the Japanese admirals, had miscalculated American industrial capacity. American shipyards were not just building warships, they were building merchant vessels at a pace that defied traditional naval arithmetic. The Liberty ship program, using mass production techniques, would eventually produce a new cargo ship every 42 days on average. At peak production, American shipyards would launch 3 ships per day. German U-boats would sink over 3,000 Allied merchant ships during the war. American shipyards would build over 5,000 vessels to replace them. The arithmetic was brutal and simple. America could build ships faster than Germany could sink them. In Italy, Benito Mussolini followed Hitler's declaration of war with his own announcement. Italy, already at war with Britain in North Africa and the Mediterranean, now added America to its list of enemies. But Mussolini's declaration lacked conviction. The Italian military was already overstretched. Campaigns in Greece had stalled. British forces had driven Italian armies back across Libya. Italian troops in East Africa had surrendered. The Italian navy, despite some successes, was bottled up in the Mediterranean, unable to challenge British control of the seas. Adding America to this list of enemies did not strengthen Italy's position. It simply added another name to the eventual reckoning. Mussolini had built his regime on the myth of a revived Roman Empire, but by December 1941, the myth was crumbling. Italian generals privately understood that Italy lacked the industrial base to sustain a modern war. Italian factories could not produce enough tanks, aircraft, or trucks to keep pace with losses. Italian soldiers fought with courage, but they fought with inadequate equipment and insufficient supplies. The declaration of war on America was a political gesture, not a strategic decision. Italy would fight because it was allied with Germany, not because it had any realistic plan for defeating America. The strategic reality that all 3 Axis powers would confront was this. America possessed an industrial capacity that dwarfed their combined production. In 1941, America produced more steel than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. American automobile factories, converted to war production, would eventually produce more tanks than all Axis nations together. American aircraft factories would produce over 300,000 military aircraft during the war, more than double Axis production. American shipyards would launch a fleet that would outnumber all other navies on Earth. But raw production numbers only told part of the story. The other part was geography and strategic position. America sat between 2 oceans, protected by thousands of miles of water from direct attack. American factories could operate at full capacity without fear of bombing. American cities would never experience the devastation that would level German and Japanese urban centers. American farms would feed American workers and soldiers and still produce surplus to supply Allied nations. America could build, train, and deploy military forces in both oceans simultaneously because the American homeland was untouchable. This geographic advantage, combined with industrial capacity, created a strategic reality that Axis leaders would slowly, painfully come to understand. America did not have to choose between the Atlantic and Pacific. America could fight everywhere, at once, at full strength. The two-ocean war was not a burden that would overextend American forces. It was simply the operational deployment of American power. The first hints of this reality emerged in mid-1942. In June, American naval forces defeated a Japanese fleet at Midway, sinking 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. The battle was a tactical victory, but its strategic implications were profound. Japan had lost 4 carriers that would take years to replace. America had lost 1 carrier, the Yorktown, but had 3 more already under construction and dozens more on order. The arithmetic of replacement was brutally unfavorable for Japan. Yamamoto understood immediately. After Midway, he reportedly told his staff that Japan had lost the war. The 6 months to a year of running wild had expired. Now came the phase he had always feared, the long, grinding war of attrition against an enemy with superior resources. Every Japanese ship sunk, every aircraft destroyed, every trained pilot killed represented an irreplaceable loss. America would replace its losses and add more. The mathematics of industrial warfare had turned against Japan. In Germany, the reality emerged more slowly but no less certainly. In November 1942, American forces landed in North Africa as part of Operation Torch. This was America's first major ground offensive in the European theater, and it revealed the scale of American commitment. Over 100,000 American troops landed in Morocco and Algeria, supported by hundreds of ships and aircraft. The landings were not flawless. American forces were inexperienced, but the sheer scale of the operation demonstrated that America was not going to limit itself to supplying Britain. American forces would fight in Europe in strength. Simultaneously, American bombers began arriving in Britain as part of the 8th Air Force. American strategic doctrine called for daylight precision bombing of German industrial targets. German fighter pilots initially welcomed the American bombers, expecting easy victories against unescorted bombers flying in daylight. And initially, German fighters did inflict heavy losses. But American bomber production simply absorbed the losses and sent more. By 1943, the 8th Air Force was launching raids with hundreds of bombers. By 1944, raids of 1,000 bombers became routine. German industry, German cities, German transportation networks came under systematic destruction from the air. And crucially, this bombing campaign in Europe did not reduce American operations in the Pacific. American forces were simultaneously advancing across the Central Pacific, island by island, and up the coast of New Guinea toward the Philippines. American submarines were strangling Japanese shipping. American carriers were raiding Japanese bases. The two-ocean war was in full operation, and American forces were advancing in both theaters. Hitler's response to this reality was to deny it. In his speeches and private conversations, he continued to insist that America was weak, that American resolve would crack, that the Allied coalition would fracture. He seized on any American setback, any Allied disagreement, as proof that his assessment was correct. When American forces suffered heavy casualties at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, Hitler declared it proof of American military incompetence. When Allied leaders disagreed over strategy at conferences, Hitler saw evidence of a coalition on the verge of collapse. But Hitler's generals understood better. After the German defeat at Stalingrad in February 1943, after the surrender of German forces in North Africa in May 1943, after the Allied invasion of Sicily in July 1943, German military leaders privately acknowledged that Germany could not win. The question was no longer whether Germany would lose, but when and under what terms? Some generals hoped for a negotiated peace with the Western Allies, a separate peace that would allow Germany to concentrate against the Soviet Union. But this hope rested on the same misunderstanding that had plagued Axis strategy from the beginning. The belief that the Allies would break apart, that America would prioritize one enemy over another, that the two-ocean commitment would prove unsustainable. It would not. At the Casablanca Conference in January 1943, Roosevelt and Churchill announced that the Allies would accept nothing less than unconditional surrender from Germany, Italy, and Japan. There would be no negotiated peace, no separate agreements, no opportunity for Axis powers to split the Allied coalition. The announcement clarified what should have been obvious from the beginning. America and Britain were committed to total victory in both Europe and Asia, and they possessed the resources to achieve it. For Japan, the reality became undeniable in 1944. American forces invaded the Marshall Islands in February, the Marianas in June, the Philippines in October. Each invasion followed the same pattern: overwhelming American naval and air superiority, methodical reduction of Japanese defenses, steady American advance. Japanese defenders fought with suicidal determination, but determination could not overcome the material imbalance. American forces simply had more of everything: more ships, more aircraft, more artillery, more supplies, more trained replacements. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 revealed the extent of Japanese decline. Japanese naval aviators, hastily trained replacements for the experienced pilots lost in previous battles, flew against American carrier groups defended by radar-directed fighters and anti-aircraft fire. American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese losses were catastrophic. Over 600 aircraft destroyed, 3 carriers sunk. American losses were minimal. The battle demonstrated that Japan no longer possessed the trained pilots or the aircraft production to challenge American naval air power. The ocean that Japan had hoped to defend was now an American lake. In October 1944, American forces returned to the Philippines. General Douglas MacArthur waded ashore at Leyte, fulfilling his promise to return. The Japanese Navy, in a desperate gamble, committed its remaining major surface units to the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. The battle was a decisive American victory. Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Japan's ability to defend its remaining territories was broken. By early 1945, American bombers were flying regular missions over Japan itself. American submarines had destroyed the Japanese merchant fleet, cutting Japan off from the resources of its conquered territories. The empire that Japan had seized in 1942 was now isolated, its garrisons starving, its supply lines severed. American forces prepared for the invasion of Japan's home islands, an operation that would involve millions of troops and would be supported by the full weight of American naval and air power. In Germany, the end came in stages. American and British forces landed in Normandy in June 1944, opening a true second front in Western Europe. The invasion involved over 150,000 troops on the first day, supported by thousands of ships and aircraft. It was the largest amphibious operation in history, and it demonstrated beyond any doubt that America could project power across oceans on a scale that Axis leaders had thought impossible. The Normandy invasion did not reduce American operations in the Pacific. American forces invaded Saipan the same month. The two-ocean war continued at full intensity in both theaters. German forces fought with skill and determination, but they were ground down by the arithmetic of attrition. American factories produced 50,000 tanks in 1944. Germany produced 19,000. American factories produced 96,000 aircraft. Germany produced 39,000. American oil fields produced over 4 million barrels of oil per day. Germany, dependent on synthetic fuel plants, produced a fraction of that amount, and American strategic bombers were systematically destroying German fuel production. By late 1944, German tanks and aircraft sat immobile for lack of fuel. Hitler, isolated in his bunker, continued to believe in miracle weapons and wonder weapons that would turn the tide. V-2 rockets fell on London, but they could not stop American bombers over Germany. Jet fighters showed technical superiority, but Germany could not produce them in sufficient numbers or fuel them adequately. Hitler's last major offensive, the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, was a desperate gamble that failed. German forces achieved initial surprise, but American reinforcements contained the breakthrough, and American air power, once the weather cleared, devastated German armored columns. The offensive consumed Germany's last strategic reserves and achieved nothing. In April 1945, American and Soviet forces linked up at the Elbe River, cutting Germany in half. Hitler, in his bunker beneath Berlin, finally confronted the reality he had denied for so long. Germany was defeated. The Third Reich, that was supposed to last 1,000 years, had survived 12. On April 30th, Hitler committed suicide. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945. In Japan, leaders faced the same inevitable conclusion. American forces had captured Iwo Jima in March 1945 and Okinawa in June, providing bases for the final assault on Japan. American bombers were systematically destroying Japanese cities through incendiary raids. The raid on Tokyo in March killed over 100,000 people in a single night. Japan's industrial capacity was shattered, its navy destroyed, its army fragmented across isolated garrisons throughout Asia and the Pacific. But Japanese military leaders continued to argue for fighting to the end, for making the invasion of Japan so costly that America would negotiate terms rather than pay the blood price. This was the same miscalculation that had plagued Japanese strategy from the beginning. The belief that America would choose a negotiated peace over total victory, that American public opinion would force a compromise. It was the same misunderstanding of American determination that had led Japan to attack Pearl Harbor in the first place. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th ended the debate. Japan surrendered unconditionally on August 15th, 1945. The war was over. What Axis leaders had said when they realized America would fight a two-ocean war was ultimately less important than what they had failed to understand. They had failed to understand American industrial capacity, American geographic advantages, American strategic determination, and American national unity once attacked. They had mistaken American democracy for weakness, American prosperity for softness, American reluctance to enter the war for inability to fight it. Yamamoto had understood, but his understanding had come too late and carried too little weight against the momentum of Japanese military planning. Hitler had never understood, blinded by ideology and contempt. Mussolini had understood that Italy was overmatched, but had lacked the courage to break with Germany. Tojo had gambled that America would not pay the price of total war, and had lost everything on that miscalculation. The two-ocean war was not a burden that overstretched American forces. It was the deployment of American power in its natural configuration, leveraging geography, industry, and strategic position to fight everywhere simultaneously. Axis leaders had planned for a war in which they could defeat their enemies sequentially, in which they could exploit Allied divisions and limitations. Instead, they faced an America that fought in both oceans at once, at full strength in both, and that possessed the industrial capacity to sustain that effort indefinitely. The miscalculation was not merely tactical or strategic. It was fundamental. Axis leaders had failed to understand the nature of American power and the character of American determination. They had attacked a nation they did not understand and they had paid for that ignorance with total defeat. The Two-Ocean War was not something America struggled to fight. It was simply how America fought. And once committed to that fight, America would accept nothing less than unconditional surrender in both oceans. That was the reality that Axis leaders came to understand, too late to change their fate.